Everybody like and subscribe, praise the bell icon. Story number 1.
In 1973, off the coast of Maine, there was a lighthouse called Briar Point Light. It had long been decommissioned, but not torn down, just left to rot on a lonely crag of rock, battered by the Atlantic. Locals called it the Widow's Light because of a story that went back to the early 1900s. A keeper named Thomas Ely had taken the post after his wife died unexpectedly. He brought her body to the island with him, unable to let her go, and supposedly kept her in a rocking chair in the keeper's quarters. He was found hanging in the stairwell months later, and they said you could still hear the chair creaking when no one was there. By the 70s, the place had gained a sort of urban legend status. Kids dared each other to row out at night. Fishermen refused to look at it during storms, and some swore lights would flicker through the windows even though the place had no power. It was a dead spot on the sea, avoided even by birds. A man named Simon Greaves was hired to assess the structure for possible restoration. He was a preservationist with a fondness for forgotten places. He arrived in October when the ocean was slate gray and the air sharp with cold. The plan was for him to stay 3 nights, document the interior, and return with a full report. He took a boat out with 2 locals who dropped him off on the jagged rock and left without saying much. Simon brought food, a lantern, and a tape recorder to log his findings. The first night passed quietly, cold wind creaking beams, the ocean groaning below. He made notes about the iron staircase, the cracked lantern room glass, the decayed wood. He found the keeper's quarters mostly intact, and in the corner he saw it. A rocking chair, barely upright, worn down but unmistakable. He laughed to himself about the legend and recorded a note about it being the creepiest furnishing in the place. That night, as he tried to sleep, the wind outside rose. It howled through the broken windows and under the door. At 2:14 a.m., he was awoken by the sound of creaking wood. Not the roof, not the floorboards. A single rhythmic creak, 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 like a chair swaying in a lazy arc. He lay still, holding his breath, convincing himself it was the wind, but it didn't stop. It went on for nearly 20 minutes. The next day, he checked the chair. It had moved, only slightly, maybe an inch. Maybe he bumped it. He tried not to dwell. He walked the island, took more notes, and when he returned to the lighthouse, he brought the chair down to the lower level and stuffed it into a storage closet. He recorded a note on the tape. Rocking chairs got too much local lore attached. Going to remove it from view so I don't psych myself out. That night, the creaking returned, at the exact same time, 2:14 a.m. Only this time it didn't come from downstairs. It came from the upper landing, outside his room. He froze. The recorder clicked on by itself, something he didn't think was possible, and started recording dead air. He heard something else, just barely, a woman's voice, whispering behind the creaks, just under the wind. He didn't want me to leave. On the 3rd day, he found the chair back in the keeper's quarters. He ran, packed his things, called in an emergency pickup on the radio. He left before sundown, pale and shaking, and didn't say a word to the boatman. Weeks later, the tapes were found in his apartment. He never returned to work, vanished, supposedly took a train west and started over. But those tapes, they were passed around quietly among enthusiasts and historians. Most of the recordings are static, wind, waves, diary-like observations. But on the second night's tape, at exactly 2:17 a.m., there's a woman's voice, clear as day. She says, "He kept me here too, but he won't let anyone leave." The chair was never recovered, and the last person who went to retrieve it, some thrill-seeker YouTuber in 2014, disappeared after spending 1 night on the island. The Coast Guard found his camera wedged between the rocks, saltwater logged and shattered. The footage? Unusable. Except for a single frame at the end of the tape, the lighthouse staircase, empty, except for the rocking chair at the top, facing the wall, rocking slowly.
Story number 2.
In 1998, a marine biologist named Dr. Evelyn Carr was stationed on a temporary research post just off the coast of Washington State. Her team was studying tidal patterns in marine life around the old Finch Isle Lighthouse, a decaying tower that hadn't been active since the mid-50s. The island was nothing more than a jagged spit of stone and seaweed. The lighthouse had stood empty for decades, yet something about it always unsettled people. Locals called it the Eye because of the way the glass lantern room always seemed to gleam in sunlight, even when completely clouded over or covered in bird droppings and grime. Sometimes, fishermen swore they saw it blink. Evelyn didn't believe in ghost stories. She was logical, cold, focused, the kind of person who trusted data more than feelings. She and two grad students, Jamie and Luis, set up their monitoring equipment on the shore, but curiosity drew them to the lighthouse their first night. It was empty, choked in seabird droppings and mold, but it had been sealed in a strange way, thick iron locks on the inside of doors, long-forgotten papers nailed to walls, some in English, others in what looked like Latin. Jamie took photos. Luis joked that it looked like the last keeper was trying to keep something in. On the second day, their instruments started malfunctioning. Tidal monitors gave conflicting readings. Barometers surged and dropped with no clear pattern. At night, Jamie swore he saw a figure in the lantern room, a silhouette, perfectly still, just standing in the window. But when he brought it up, Evelyn shut him down. "Data, not dreams," she told him. By the third night, something changed. Evelyn's notes became erratic, found later in her waterlogged field journals. "Woke up at 2:47 a.m. to whispering," she wrote. "Voice said, 'I see you through the glass.' Checked with Luis. He was asleep. No one there." They should have left then, but they stayed one more night. On the fourth morning, Jamie was missing. His tent was still zipped, boots inside, no sign of struggle, no drag marks, just gone. Evelyn and Luis combed the island, but there was only one place left to check, the lighthouse. Inside, it smelled different. Not just rot or damp, but sweet, almost like decay mixed with flowers. They climbed to the top. The lantern room had always been sealed. The door rusted shut, but now it stood wide open, and the glass, once fogged and dirty, had been polished clean, gleaming, shining like an eye. Luis stepped inside first. Evelyn said later that she heard him whisper, "It's so bright in here," before he went silent. She waited, 10 seconds, 20, then stepped in after him. He was gone. No scream, no sound, just gone. The room was empty, but in the glass reflection, she swore she saw both of them, Jamie and Luis, standing behind her, staring at her through the warped, curved panes. Their mouths moved, but there was no sound, and behind them, something tall, thin, gray, watching through the center of the glass. Its face, a smooth oval, turned toward her, and it blinked. She ran, didn't even grab her gear. She flagged down a passing patrol boat by waving her shirt in the air like a distress signal. They found no trace of the students. The data was corrupted, the equipment fried. But Evelyn's journals were recovered, found buried near the base of the lighthouse in a waterproof case. The last page read, "It watches through the lens. It doesn't live in the lighthouse. The lighthouse is it." The Finch Isle Lighthouse was later torn down by order of the Coast Guard. But the demolition team reported something odd. Even after they shattered the glass and stripped the tower to rubble, one of the panes of the lantern room glass was found miles inland 2 days later, propped up against a tree, facing east, reflecting nothing but the empty gray sky.
Story number 3.
In 1962, a weather station technician named Harold Tibbett was assigned to monitor storms off the coast of Newfoundland. The government had recently reactivated a dormant lighthouse on a spit of rock called Sable Spire, a narrow, jagged piece of land constantly battered by waves and fog. The structure was old, built in the late 1800s, and barely functional, but its location was crucial for cargo ships navigating the rough Atlantic waters. Harold was a quiet, meticulous man who'd lost his wife the year before. Maybe that's why he took the post, just to be away from people. He was meant to stay for 4 weeks, logging weather data and doing basic maintenance on the lighthouse. Supplies would be flown in every 10 days by helicopter, no contact unless there was an emergency. On the first night, the fog rolled in thick and fast, wrapping the island in white. The light turned mechanically overhead, itself casting sweeping arcs into the mist. The place groaned with age, pipes hissed, floorboards thudded. But Harold noticed something strange during his midnight check. The light paused. It stopped moving for exactly 7 seconds, pointed straight down the stairs toward the living quarters. He thought it was mechanical error. Logged it. Tried to fix the mechanism the next morning. But it was fine. Everything worked. Still that night, same thing. Light paused. 7 seconds. Aimed at the stairs. The third night, he woke up to the sound of heavy footsteps above him, in the lantern room. It shouldn't have been possible. The access hatch was bolted, and only he had the key. He went up. Nothing there. But the light was off, as if someone had flipped the breaker. After that, things got worse. Every night at exactly 3:11 a.m., the light would stop moving and shine directly into Harold's room. He boarded up the window. The next night, the boards were torn down, not broken, just removed, neatly, as if unscrewed. He didn't hear a sound. He began hearing voices through the pipes, distant, whispering, sometimes his name, sometimes crying. He stopped sleeping, stopped eating. On the 10th day, the helicopter arrived with supplies. The pilot said he found Harold standing at the base of the lighthouse, barefoot in the wet grass, staring up at the glass. He didn't respond when spoken to. When they brought him into the mainland, he kept repeating one thing. It looks for something. It shines until it finds it. And when it finds it, it comes down. He was institutionalized. Never spoke again. The last disturbing part? When the next technician, Raymond Morris, took over the post, he found a thick binder of notes from Harold, including one sketch that stood out, a drawing of the lighthouse interior with a stick figure drawn at the top of the stairs where the lantern light always paused. It was labeled, "Not Me." Raymond lasted only 3 nights. He sent a Mayday transmission that simply said, "The light sees me now." He was never found. To this day, pilots flying over Sable Spire at night report strange behavior from the light, flickering, sweeping faster than it should, turning inward like it's looking down inside itself. The lighthouse has since been shuttered and declared unsafe. But locals claim that sometimes, even with no power running to it, you can still see the light flash from miles away. Always sweeping, always pausing, always watching.
Story number 4.
In 2004, a salvage team was hired to remove the remains of an old shipwreck tangled near the base of Morrow's End Lighthouse, a crumbling tower on the Oregon coast. The lighthouse had been abandoned since the 1950s after a series of unexplained incidents. 2 keepers went missing within 6 months of each other, and the third one, Henry Mott, was found wandering the beach barefoot, whispering, "There's something in the fog that doesn't leave when the sun rises." The team, 4 people total, arrived by boat with gear and tools, planning to camp on the island for 2 nights. The lighthouse wasn't their concern, just a backdrop to the wreckage they needed to remove. The island was only accessible during low tide, and the fog rolled in like it had a personality, thick, curling along the rocks, swallowing sound. On the first night, the team sat around a fire and joked about the stories. One of them, Alex, wandered into the lighthouse out of curiosity and returned pale. She said she saw something carved all over the walls inside, hundreds of symbols, spirals, and what looked like tally marks. But they weren't scratched into the stone, they were burned in. The stone itself was scorched, as if someone had branded it from the inside out. The next morning, they found one of their ropes, thick salvage-grade line, strung in a perfect noose hanging from the top of the lighthouse stairs. None of them admitted to putting it there. It unnerved them, but they kept working. Money talks. That night, the fog came in heavier than before. One of the divers, Jordan, went missing. They found his wetsuit the next morning draped over a rock near the wreck, dry, folded, like someone had carefully laid it out. But no sign of him. No drag marks, no footprints. Alex insisted they leave. The others wanted to finish the job. The final straw came on the 3rd night when they heard pounding coming from inside the lighthouse, slow, deliberate, and from the top of the tower, like fists on glass. But the light hadn't worked in decades. They went inside, flashlights shaking, and saw the lens, the massive Fresnel lens at the top, begin to spin on its own, even though the mechanism was rusted solid. As it turned, it flashed once, then again. And in the beam of light, just for a second, they saw someone standing on the beach outside. Not Jordan, someone taller, thinner, wearing the same uniform as the old lighthouse keepers from the 40s. The beam passed, and he was gone. The team fled that night, leaving gear and salvage behind. Months later, one of them, Mira, got curious and went back alone to take photos. Her last message was a voicemail sent to Alex. In it, she whispered, "The markings, they're growing. They're on the outside of the tower now." And the light, Alex, the light turned on before I even got to the door. Then static. then silence. The voicemail ends with 5 seconds of deep, labored breathing and the faint sound of the light sweeping in the background, even though the lighthouse had no power, no generator, and no functional lens left. Mira was never found. And now, boaters say if you drift too close to Morrow's End on a foggy night, you can see the light flicker faintly, flashing in slow, irregular intervals, like it's searching for someone or something, still waiting.
Story number 5.
In 1987, a documentary filmmaker named Cal Monroe set out to explore abandoned American lighthouses for a niche horror architecture series. One of the lesser-known structures on his list was Dalhurst Rocklight, an offshore lighthouse off the coast of Lake Superior, built on a slab of jagged stone that barely rose above the waterline. It had been decommissioned in 1961 after an unexplained fire in the keeper's quarters that left the last resident, Miles Denton, severely burned and unable to speak. Denton spent his final days in a psychiatric hospital, drawing pictures of spirals and distorted human faces with hollow eyes. No one had set foot in Dalhurst Rock Light in over 2 decades. There were no roads to it, no landing docks, just a narrow ladder bolted into the wet rock. Locals didn't talk about the place. Fishermen avoided it, even when the water was calm. A few swore that at night, in certain conditions, the lantern room still glowed red. Cal didn't care about the folklore. He brought a cameraman, a drone operator, and a sound tech. They arrived in the late afternoon, climbed the ladder with their gear, and found the lighthouse interior completely untouched. Dusty, yes, but undisturbed. It was like whoever had last been there left mid-thought. A journal still open. A tea kettle still sitting on the stove, rusted through. That night, they set up sleeping bags and started filming B-roll. Cal wandered off with a handheld camera, exploring alone for mood shots. He made his way to the lantern room, where the shattered remains of the red Fresnel lens still stood, blackened by the fire. While filming, he muttered into the mic, "Weird, feels like it's warmer up here than it should be." Then silence. He didn't come down for over an hour. When he did, his eyes were bloodshot, and he said he didn't remember going up at all. The footage he shot was glitchy, but one clip stood out. 12 minutes of him standing motionless, staring into the ruined lens, breathing heavily, whispering something over and over, too faint to make out. That night, the team heard footsteps circling the tower from the outside. They ran to the windows, no one. Then they heard a loud clanging, something climbing the ladder they'd used to access the island. But when they opened the door, there was nothing. Just water, no boat, no movement. The next morning, the drone operator was gone. His sleeping bag looked untouched. His gear sat where he left it. But he was just gone. The others searched the tiny island, then the lighthouse. In the lantern room, they found a trail of wet footprints leading in a circle, over and over again, as if someone had been walking in loops around the lens. In the center of the floor was the drone operator's jacket, laid out flat, with one of the old scorched spiral drawings resting on top of it. They left immediately. The footage was never released. Cal withdrew from the public eye, sold his equipment, and refused to talk about the trip. But a year later, a tape surfaced online. No one knew who uploaded it. It was a single static-ridden shot from the Dalhurst trip, the lantern room at night, flickering red with light. You can hear heavy breathing. Then a voice, distant, layered over itself like multiple people speaking at once, whispers, "He burned the way out. Now the light keeps them in." No one's been back since. But sometimes, hikers along the Superior shoreline say they can see a faint red flicker way out on the water, pulsing through the mist. It only flashes once every 30 seconds, and it's always pointing straight inland.
Story number 6.
In the early 1970s, a small crew was sent to rebuild the crumbling lighthouse at Gray Hollow Point, a remote outcrop of land on the northern coast of Maine. The lighthouse had been abandoned for nearly 40 years after the death of the last keeper, a man named Charles Loring. His body was discovered in the tower in the fall of 1934, face contorted in terror, with his arms stretched out as if he had been trying to reach something. No one could explain what had happened, though rumors swirled about strange occurrences in the years leading up to his death. Lights that appeared even when there was no power, voices heard on the wind, and shadows that didn't move with the tide. The new crew arrived in the late summer of 1972, and their task was simple: restore the tower, reinforce the foundations, and make it safe to use again. There were 4 men, 2 seasoned laborers, a foreman, and a young man named Eric, who was tasked with documenting the work for the local historical society. The first few days passed without incident. The weather was clear and the work moved quickly. But on the 3rd night, the weather shifted. A thick fog rolled in from the sea, and the wind began to howl against the windows. The crew stayed in the tower, gathering around the small fireplace, trying to stay warm as the temperature dropped. Around midnight, they heard a faint knocking on the door. It was muffled, hesitant. One of the laborers, Tom, went to investigate, but found nothing, just the oppressive silence of the fog. As the night wore on, strange things started happening. Eric, who had been working alone on the upper levels of the tower, came down with a pale face and wide eyes. He claimed he had heard whispers coming from the walls, soft, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to come from all directions. The others dismissed it as fatigue or the wind playing tricks on him. The next day, Eric was visibly shaken. He kept to himself, but as night approached, he grew more and more agitated. At dinner, he told the crew that he had been hearing the whispers again, this time more distinct, calling his name. "I swear I saw someone up there," he said, his voice trembling. "A man in the lantern room, but when I went up there, it was empty, just darkness." The foreman, a gruff man named Jack, told him to get some rest. But that night, Eric couldn't sleep. He lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind howl. Then, as the fog crept through the cracks in the window, he heard it again, the faint knock on the door. He got up, shaking, and opened the door. No one was there, but something had changed. The fog seemed to have thickened, almost as if it were alive, swirling around the tower, pressing against the windows with a strange urgency. Eric stepped outside, drawn by a force he couldn't explain. He walked toward the base of the lighthouse, where the old iron ladder led up to the lantern room. There, standing at the top of the ladder, was the figure of a man, a tall, shadowy form, cloaked in darkness, with a face that was indistinct but twisted with something like pain. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching Eric, its eyes gleaming faintly in the fog. Eric froze. His breath caught in his throat as he watched the figure raise a hand, pointing down toward the base of the tower. Slowly, the figure's mouth opened, but there was no sound, just a silence so thick it pressed against his ears. Then the wind howled, and the figure was gone. Eric stumbled back into the tower, shaking. He was convinced the lighthouse was haunted, but his warnings went unheeded. The crew thought he was losing his grip, and the next morning, they pressed on with their work. That night, though, things took a darker turn. Around 2:30 a.m., the tower was rocked by a loud crash. The crew rushed downstairs to find one of the laborers, Tom, lying unconscious at the base of the tower, a pool of blood forming around his head. The others were frantic, but when they checked for signs of life, they found none. He had been killed, blunt force trauma, but no obvious weapon. The foreman called for help, but there was no response. The radio had failed. The fog was so thick they couldn't even see the edge of the island. The lighthouse, now silent, felt like a tomb. They tried to make sense of it, but something felt off. As they gathered around Tom's body, the whispers started again, quiet at first, then louder, as if the walls themselves were speaking. "I told you to leave," the voice said, faint but clear. "I told you to leave." The crew was terrified. They packed up their things and attempted to escape, but when they reached the base of the lighthouse, the ladder was gone. The fog had consumed the island. There was no way out. The lighthouse had become a prison. The next morning, a search party arrived to find the tower completely empty. No sign of the crew. No trace of Tom's body. The only thing left behind was Eric's journal, found near the base of the lighthouse. Its final entry written in a frantic hand. "The fog isn't the worst of it. The man who died here, he isn't gone. He's still waiting. And the light, it won't let you leave." The lighthouse was eventually demolished in the late 1970s, but local fishermen still claim they can hear voices and see lights in the fog near the site. Some say it's just the wind, but others swear the man in the lantern room still watches, waiting for those who dare to return.
Story number 7.
In 1953, The U.S. Coast Guard had just decommissioned the Hightower Reef Lighthouse, an isolated structure situated a few miles off the coast of Michigan. The lighthouse, perched on a jagged rock surrounded by deep, dark waters, had been a crucial aid for ships navigating the dangerous waters. But over the years, stories of strange happenings, strange lights, eerie noises, and even disappearances had begun to circle the tower. Some believed the place was cursed. Others were convinced it was haunted. The lighthouse had been abandoned for over a year when a small crew of salvage workers was sent in to strip the building of anything of value. Their task was to clear the space and prepare it for eventual demolition, but no one was eager to take the assignment due to the rumors. Regardless, the Coast Guard pressed on, and the team of 4 men, Tom, Jack, Marcus, and Glenn, set out for the island. They arrived during a storm, the water choppy, and the lighthouse looming like a dark sentinel through the rain. The tower itself was even more dilapidated than expected. Windows broken, the metal steps rusted through, and the once glowing lantern room dark and lifeless. But they set up camp inside, intent on completing the job. The first night passed uneventfully, though Marcus was uneasy, feeling as though the walls were watching him. The wind screamed through the cracks in the lighthouse, but nothing unusual occurred. It was the second night that things began to shift. Around 11:30 p.m., the 4 men were sitting around their campfire, sharing stories, when they heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the metal stairs outside. At first, they assumed it was the storm playing tricks on them, but the sound grew louder, deliberate, as if someone was walking toward the top of the lighthouse. Jack stood up, his face pale. "Who's up there?" he called out, expecting one of the others to play a prank. But there was no answer. The footsteps continued, growing louder. Marcus grabbed a flashlight and headed toward the staircase to investigate. But the moment his foot hit the first step, the sound stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. The men exchanged uneasy glances, unsure what to make of it. Marcus called up to the tower, but no one answered. The 4 of them, now thoroughly spooked, checked every room. They found nothing. No intruders, no animals, just the cold, empty tower. That night, as they tried to sleep, the strange sounds continued. This time, they heard faint whispering, like voices just beyond the edge of hearing. The men could not make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, urgent, anxious. It was as though something was warning them. By the 3rd day, the workers had grown increasingly agitated. Jack claimed that every time he looked out the window, he saw figures moving across the shoreline just outside their reach, but when he tried to investigate, they disappeared into the fog. Tom insisted he'd seen shadows moving within the tower itself, at the corners of his vision, flickering between the gaps in the walls. They began working in separate shifts, each man isolating himself in a different part of the lighthouse. But as night fell, things only grew worse. Around midnight, Glenn, who had been working in the basement to remove old equipment, came rushing upstairs in a panic. His face was white, his breath shallow. He stammered, "I saw something down there in the dark." The others were skeptical, but Glenn insisted it was real. He described seeing a figure, a tall man, pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes. The figure had stood silently in the shadows, watching him as if waiting for something. But when Glenn shone his flashlight at it, the figure vanished. The group dismissed it as exhaustion setting in, but the tension was palpable. That night, they decided to stick together. They barricaded themselves in the top floor of the tower, trying to get some rest. But the noises continued, faint scratching, whispering, and the unmistakable sound of footsteps. By the time dawn broke, only 3 of the men remained. Marcus was gone. The remaining workers searched the entire lighthouse and the surrounding rock, calling Marcus's name. There was no sign of him, no footprints, no signs of struggle. He had simply vanished, as though the lighthouse itself had swallowed him whole. Panic set in. The men packed their bags, determined to leave the cursed place. As they gathered their equipment, they noticed something strange. The walls of the lighthouse were covered in symbols. The designs looked like ancient runes burned into the stone, creeping up the walls. They had been there all along, unnoticed by the men, but now they seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. The storm that had been brewing suddenly became violent, And as the workers descended the steps of the lighthouse to the boat dock, they felt as if something was watching them from above. The door slammed shut behind them with a deafening bang. It wasn't until they returned to the mainland that they realized something even more horrifying. The boatman who had transported them to the island refused to come back for them. "You never should have gone there," he said, his voice trembling. "There's a curse on that place. Everyone who stays too long becomes part of it. Don't you see? It waits." The men never spoke of what happened at Hightower Reef Lighthouse again. The authorities were never able to explain Marcus's disappearance. There were no records of any bodies recovered from the water, nor any signs of foul play. To this day, no one dares go near the island, and Hightower Reef Lighthouse sits silently, its light never to shine again. Fishermen still report strange occurrences near the reef, disembodied voices on the wind, shadowy figures glimpsed in the mist, and the occasional flash of light from the lighthouse's now destroyed lantern room. No one knows exactly what happened to Marcus, but the locals believe he, and the others, were taken by whatever lurks in the shadows of the lighthouse, forever bound to it, waiting for the next unwitting soul to come too close.
Story number 8.
In the late 1960s, a strange series of disappearances plagued the coastal town of Blackwater Bay, located in a remote area of Washington state. The source of these disappearances was linked to the old, decaying lighthouse on Seabrook Isle, a small, isolated island only accessible by boat. The lighthouse had been abandoned for over 40 years, its once vibrant white walls now a dull gray, weathered by salt water and relentless winds. No one knew exactly why the lighthouse had been abandoned, but the few who lived nearby whispered of things that should never be spoken of a keeper who had gone mad, of an ancient curse that had haunted the tower for generations. The disappearances started quietly at first. Local fishermen would occasionally vanish after spending a night out on the water near the island, but no one paid much attention. After all, Blackwater Bay was a dangerous place, where the waters were treacherous and the weather unpredictable. But then, in the summer of 1967, things took a darker turn. It began when a young woman named Lily Simmons went missing. She was a photographer, hired to take some pictures of the coastline for a tourist pamphlet. She was last seen heading towards Seabrook Isle to photograph the lighthouse. Days passed without word from her, and when her camera was eventually found washed up on the shore, it revealed strange, unsettling images, blurred photos of the lighthouse with strange shapes and shadows lurking in the background. The last photo, however, was the most chilling. It showed a figure standing in the doorway of the lighthouse, its features obscured by a thick fog, but its eyes were clear, wide, hollow, and staring directly into the lens. The town was shaken by Lily's disappearance, but the authorities couldn't find any trace of her on the island. Then, a month later, another disappearance. This time, a local fisherman named Thomas Rivers, who had been known to frequently visit Seabrook Isle. He left early one morning to check his traps, but he never returned. His boat was found drifting off the island, the motor still running, but no sign of him. The only clue was a small, tattered piece of paper found in the boat, scrawled with words that made little sense. "The light sees them all. They come for you, in the fog. It waits in the tower." A week after Thomas's disappearance, the local police decided to investigate Seabrook Isle themselves. They assembled a small team of officers and volunteers, including a seasoned investigator named Carl Jensen, known for his level-headedness in solving cases. Carl had heard the rumors about the lighthouse, but he was determined to get to the bottom of things. He had a deep sense of skepticism and thought it was simply an isolated area with some dangerous people who didn't want to be found. They arrived at Seabrook Isle at dusk, the sun dipping below the horizon as they made their way to the lighthouse. The fog rolled in thicker than it ever had before, swallowing the landscape. As they made their way up to the lighthouse, Carl noticed the oppressive silence. It was as if the island itself had been holding its breath. When they reached the door of the lighthouse, Carl tried the handle. It was unlocked. The door creaked open slowly, revealing the dark interior. There, in the center of the room, was an old journal. It was covered in dust, its pages yellowed with age. Carl flipped it open, and the first page made his stomach twist. It was written by the last lighthouse keeper, a man named Elias Ward, who had disappeared in 1923. His final entry was chilling. They come from the depths of the sea, under the light, and they drag you to the dark places. The light calls them. It calls me. There is no escape. I am one of them now. The light sees me. As Carl read those words, the air in the lighthouse grew colder. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. The other officers were talking quietly among themselves, but Carl's eyes were fixed on something strange. At the top of the spiral staircase leading up to the lantern room, he saw a shadow, a dark figure, just out of sight. "Who's there?" Carl called out, his voice steady. There was no response, but the shadow moved, sliding up the stairs, faster than a human could move. Carl, unable to ignore his curiosity, started up the stairs. The others followed, their footsteps echoing off the walls. When they reached the top, the lantern room was empty, but the floor was wet, as if someone had been walking around in the fog with wet boots. Then they saw it, a dark, blood-stained handprint smeared on the glass of the lantern, as if someone had pressed their palm against it in desperation. But the light hadn't been on in decades. How could the handprint be fresh? The fog outside thickened, pressing against the glass, as if something was pushing at the lighthouse from the other side. Carl felt a pressure in his chest, a feeling of being watched. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up again, and this time, he wasn't sure it was just the cold. Suddenly, a voice echoed in the darkness. It wasn't one of the men with him. It was low, guttural, like a whisper carried on the wind. "It's too late. The light is watching you." The officers turned, but there was no one there. The sound of footsteps began again, slow, deliberate, and coming from the direction of the stairs. The same sound they had heard earlier. Panicking, Carl ran down the stairs, shouting for the others to follow. But when they reached the door, it slammed shut in front of them. The fog outside had turned into a thick wall, pressing against the windows with a force that felt unnatural. They were trapped. The voices began again, low whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves, crawling under their skin. Carl tried the door again, but it wouldn't budge. He felt something watching him, something just outside of the fog, waiting. Then, from behind him, he heard it. The unmistakable sound of breathing, deep, ragged, and labored. Carl spun around but saw nothing. The room was empty, save for the faintest glow from the lantern that flickered once, casting strange shadows on the walls. And in those shadows, Carl saw them, figures moving, hunched and twisted, their faces obscured, but their eyes shining in the dark. The last thing Carl heard before everything went black was the soft, slow clicking of the lantern's mechanism, turning on by itself, casting its light across the room. When the rescue team finally arrived, they found the lighthouse abandoned. Carl's team had vanished, with only their equipment left behind. No signs of struggle, no bodies, just an empty, haunted lighthouse. To this day, Blackwater Bay is still known for its dangerous waters, but the rumors of the Seabrook Isle lighthouse persist. Fishermen talk about seeing strange lights in the fog at night, and those who venture too close to the island say they hear the soft sound of footsteps, faint whispers carried on the wind, and the unmistakable click of a lantern turning on.
Story number 9.
In the early 1980s, a small, picturesque town named Evershore sat on the edge of a vast, storm-ravaged coastline. It was a place where tourists flocked during the summer to see the scenic cliffs and rugged shorelines. But come winter, the town became desolate, quiet, almost forgotten. The most significant landmark in the town was an old lighthouse that had been out of service for decades, perched atop a jagged cliff called Widow's Watch. The lighthouse had a tragic history, linked to a series of drownings that had plagued the area in the early 1900s. No one could explain the strange deaths, except that they occurred whenever the fog rolled in thick off the ocean. The lighthouse keeper, an old man named Harold Turner, had died under mysterious circumstances just a year before the lighthouse was decommissioned. He had been the last one to tend to the lantern, and rumors told of his strange behavior in the months before his death. Some claimed he'd been hearing voices in the wind, others said he'd seen strange figures out on the rocks in the mist. Whatever it was, Harold's death was the last straw for the Coast Guard, and the lighthouse was abandoned shortly after. By the time the 1980s rolled around, no one visited the lighthouse anymore. The few who had lived in Evershore for a long time avoided it, and claiming it was cursed. Locals spoke of strange sounds echoing from the cliffs during the night and flickering lights from the lantern room, even though the light hadn't functioned in years. People who went near the lighthouse at dusk would sometimes hear a woman's laughter or the sounds of footsteps pacing in the tower, but when they went to investigate, the place was always eerily silent. Despite the warnings, a young couple, Emily and James, decided to visit the lighthouse one particularly foggy evening. They had heard the stories but didn't believe in local superstitions. Emily was an aspiring photographer, and she was eager to take some unique photos of the lighthouse at twilight. They arrived just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the cliffs. As they made their way up the winding path leading to the lighthouse, the fog thickened, creeping up from the sea like a living thing. The air grew heavy, and the eerie silence that surrounded them felt suffocating. Emily began to feel uneasy, but James, ever the skeptic, reassured her that it was just the weather. They reached the base of the lighthouse and began to explore. The door to the tower was ajar, creaking in the wind. Emily took out her camera, snapping pictures of the old structure. James wandered up the stone steps to the top, eager to see the view. As Emily set up for a shot, she heard something behind her, footsteps. At first she assumed it was James, but when she turned around, the ground was empty. The fog was thick now, and she could barely make out the outline of the lighthouse in front of her. The air felt colder, and a distant sound, almost like a whisper, seemed to emanate from the tower. Suddenly she heard a voice, a woman's voice, soft but distinct, calling her name. Emily! She whipped around, heart racing, but there was no one there. The fog was so thick she could hardly see a few feet ahead of her. Panic crept into her chest as she realized that the voice had come from within the lighthouse. James's voice broke through the fog. Emily, come on up! You've got to see this! Reluctantly, Emily moved toward the tower. Her steps felt heavy as the whispering continued, getting louder with every step. She reached the bottom of the spiral staircase and looked up. The shadows of the lighthouse stretched in odd, unnatural ways, and she could have sworn she saw movement in the lantern room. James, she called out, but her voice trembled. No answer. Heart pounding, she started up the stairs, every step echoing off the stone walls. As she climbed higher, the air grew colder. The whispering had intensified, and now she could hear faint murmurs, almost like a chant. Her hands trembled as she reached the top of the stairs and stepped into the lantern room. But James wasn't there. Instead, the room was dimly lit by a flickering light that seemed to come from nowhere, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. Emily felt a sudden chill crawl down her spine. The space seemed to press in on her, like the walls were closing in. There, in the far corner of the room, a figure stood. It was a woman, dressed in an old-fashioned white gown, her hair flowing wildly as though caught in an unseen wind. Her back was to Emily, but Emily could feel her presence, an overwhelming sense of sorrow and desperation. The figure slowly turned toward her, and Emily gasped. The woman's face was pale and gaunt, her eyes wide open, staring straight at Emily with an expression of pure terror. Her mouth moved as if speaking, but no sound emerged, only a soft, barely audible hum. Emily froze, unable to move. The woman took a step toward her, and the light flickered, casting strange, shifting shadows across the walls. It was then that Emily realized the woman wasn't walking. She was floating, moving without lifting her feet from the ground. Suddenly, the whispering intensified, and Emily felt a cold hand press against her back, urging her to move. She stumbled backward, her heart hammering in her chest. As she turned to flee, she found herself at the top of the stairs, but there was no sign of James. "James!" she screamed, but only the whispering answered. In a panic, Emily ran down the stairs, her feet barely touching the steps as she descended into the thick fog. When she reached the bottom, she called out again, but still there was no answer. The air had become thick and suffocating, and she could barely see her hand in front of her face. The fog was alive, pressing in on her, as if trying to pull her back to the lighthouse. Finally, she saw James. He was standing on the edge of the cliff, staring out into the fog, his eyes blank, unseeing. As she rushed toward him, she heard his voice, low and hollow, saying, She's waiting for you." Emily grabbed his arm and pulled him away from the edge, but the fog seemed to close around them, thickening with every step. She heard the woman's voice again, louder now, calling her name. "Emily." They ran, not looking back, until they finally made it to their car. The fog lifted as they sped down the road, but the silence between them was deafening. Neither of them spoke, and neither of them ever went back to Evershore. The next day, Emily reviewed the pictures she had taken. The photos of the lighthouse were distorted, the light flickering in unnatural patterns, but there was something even more unsettling in one of the images, a faint, ghostly figure standing at the top of the tower, watching her. That night, the whispers began again.
Story number 10.
In the early 90s, a young couple, Rachel and David, moved into a quaint, historic house in a quiet suburban neighborhood on the outskirts of Oregon. The house, built in the late 1800s, had stood the test of time, passing through multiple owners over the years. Rachel, an artist, and David, a writer, were drawn to the charm of the home and the lush, overgrown garden that surrounded it. It seemed like the perfect escape from the hustle and bustle of city life. The house, however, had a dark history, though it wasn't something most people in town talked about. The former owners, the Clarks, had mysteriously disappeared decades earlier. No one knew exactly what had happened to them, and the family's sudden departure was never fully explained. A few neighbors whispered about strange occurrences in the house, but Rachel and David, skeptical of such stories, dismissed them as mere gossip. Everything seemed perfect in the beginning. The couple spent their days unpacking and settling in, and Rachel immediately fell in love with the attic, which she planned to turn into her studio. The atmosphere of the house was peaceful, almost too peaceful, but it inspired her creativity. It wasn't until the second week that they started noticing the oddities. It began with small things, a door that would open by itself, a light that flickered despite having a fresh bulb, and strange noises at night. At first, they chalked it up to settling sounds, the creaks of an old house. But as time went on, the disturbances grew more unsettling. One evening, as Rachel was painting in her studio, she heard a soft tapping at the door. When she opened it, she found no one. David had been downstairs reading and hadn't heard anything. Thinking it was her imagination, she returned to her work, only to hear the tapping again, louder this time, almost rhythmic. She rushed to the door, but again, nothing was there. That night, Rachel woke up to the sound of something dragging across the floor. At first, she thought it was David, but he was fast asleep beside her. The sound was coming from the hallway, slow and deliberate. She listened, her heart pounding as it seemed to move toward the attic. She convinced herself it was the house settling, perhaps a mouse or something caught in the walls, but the noise was too distinct. The following evening, David and Rachel decided to explore the attic. They'd avoided it so far, not sure what to expect. The door was old and creaked when they opened it, revealing a dusty, cluttered space filled with old furniture, boxes, and cobwebs. As Rachel walked toward the back of the attic, she froze. There in the far corner was an old wooden chest. It looked out of place, as though it had been intentionally hidden. Intrigued, they opened the chest. Inside, they found old photographs, faded black and white images of the house, the Clarks, and a few others they didn't recognize. But there was something odd about the photos. In every single one, a figure stood in the background, barely noticeable at first. It was a tall, shadowy figure with hollow eyes, always standing just out of sight, but its presence was undeniable. Rachel's curiosity got the best of her. She began looking up the history of the house and the Clark family, but the more she dug, the stranger the details became. It turned out that the Clarks hadn't just disappeared. They had been part of a series of strange disappearances that occurred in the neighborhood. Neighbors had reported seeing a tall, shadowy figure near their homes, especially during the nights leading up to their disappearances. But the police had never found any evidence of foul play. It was as though the families simply vanished, leaving behind no trace except for the disturbing photographs. One night, Rachel decided to explore further. She climbed up to the attic again, feeling a growing sense of dread. As she stood in the middle of the room, she heard the faint tapping noise once more. It came from the far corner, where the chest had been. But when she turned to look, the chest was gone. In its place was a dark, empty void, as though the corner of the room had been swallowed by something. Frozen in fear, Rachel heard a voice, low and guttural, whisper from the darkness, "Get out!" She ran out of the attic, slamming the door behind her. She was trembling, unable to explain what had just happened. When she told David, he brushed it off, saying she was just exhausted. But Rachel knew something wasn't right. That night, they heard the dragging sound again, this time louder and closer. Rachel got up to check but found nothing. As she stood in the hallway, the air grew cold, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally. She felt a presence behind her, a heavy weight pressing down on her chest. She turned to look, but there was nothing there. The house felt suffocating, as though the walls themselves were closing in. The next day, Rachel had a conversation with an elderly neighbor named Mrs. Harding, who had lived in the area for as long as anyone could remember. Mrs. Harding was the only one who seemed willing to speak about the house's history, though she hesitated at first. "You should have never moved in," she warned, her voice shaking. "The house has always been hungry. The Clarks weren't the first to go, and they won't be the last." Mrs. Harding explained that there were rumors of an ancient entity, something that thrived on fear and suffering, a spirit that lived within the walls of the house. It had taken the Clarks, and it had taken others before them. People who stayed too long in the house were drawn to it, their fears and anxieties feeding it until it consumed them. That night, Rachel and David decided to leave. But when they tried to pack their things, they found that everything had changed. The layout of the house was different. The hallways were longer, the doors were in different places. It was as if the house itself had rearranged itself to trap them inside. Panic set in as they realized they couldn't escape. Every door they opened led them back to the same hallway, over and over again. The shadows seemed to move of their own accord, closing in on them. As they ran through the house, they heard footsteps behind them, slow and deliberate. A voice whispered Rachel's name, followed by a cold laugh that sent chills down her spine. They could hear the dragging sound again, closer, louder, relentless. Something was following them. Eventually, they stumbled into the attic again. But this time, the chest had returned. It was sitting in the corner as though it had never been gone. And standing beside it, watching them, was the tall, shadowy figure from the photographs, its hollow eyes glowing faintly in the dark. In that moment, they realized that they were not just trapped in the house. They had become part of its history, its next victims, bound by the darkness that had claimed so many before them. The house, it seemed, had a new set of residents. Months later, when the police went to investigate after receiving reports of strangers coming from the house, they found it abandoned. No trace of Rachel or David remained, except for the photographs, faded and worn, with a new addition, a photo of the couple standing in the doorway of the house, their eyes hollow and vacant, as though the darkness had already taken them.